Hello everyone, today we are exploring the life of Sappho. Let's start. Most of what we know about the greatest female poet of the ancient world comes from scraps of papyrus pulled from Egyptian garbage dumps. That's not an exaggeration. Sappho of Lesbos, called the 10th Muse by Plato himself, wrote approximately 10,000 lines of poetry that shaped Western literature for centuries. Today we have about 650 lines. The rest vanished, destroyed by time, religious zealots, and the simple fact that her dialect was too difficult for later copyists to bother with. But here's what survived. Fragments so powerful that scholars who spent years reconstructing them from ancient trash went blind from the work. One temporarily lost his mind. These weren't just poems. They were windows into a world where a woman's voice commanded the same respect as Homer's, where desire between women was celebrated rather than hidden, where the personal became universal through language so precise it still cuts 26 centuries later. The island of Lesbos sits in the northeastern Aegean Sea, close enough to the coast of Asia Minor that on clear days you can see across the water. Around 630 BC, possibly earlier, a girl was born there into a wealthy family. Her name was Sappho. The exact year is disputed. Some scholars place her birth around 650 or 640 BC. Others suggest closer to 630. What we know with more certainty is that she lived during a period of intense political upheaval, that she came from money, and that she would become so famous in her lifetime that cities minted coins with her face on them. Her mother's name was probably Cleis, though ancient scholars might have just guessed this based on the name of Sappho's daughter. As for her father, ancient sources list 10 different possibilities. 10. That proliferation of names suggests something important. Sappho never named him in her poetry. The leading candidate is Scamandronymus, a wealthy wine merchant. Wine trade meant serious money in the ancient Greek world. It meant connections, influence, the kind of resources that could support a daughter's education in an era when most women learned to weave and manage households. Sappho had 3 brothers, Charaxos, Lyricos, and Eurygios. We know about the first 2 because they appear in a poem discovered in 2014, pulled from yet another cache of ancient papyrus. More on that later. The middle brother, Charaxos, apparently fell for an Egyptian courtesan named Rhodopis and paid a fortune to ransom her. This scandalized the family. Sappho wrote a poem about it, criticizing her brother's choices. Even 26 centuries ago, apparently, poets were writing about their dysfunctional relatives. The island where she grew up was not peaceful. Lesbos in the 7th century BC was consumed by factional warfare between aristocratic families. These weren't minor squabbles. They were violent power struggles that ended with exiles, confiscations, and occasionally murders. Sappho's family was involved. On which side, we don't know for certain, but most scholars believe they aligned with a faction that opposed the tyrant Pittacus. Pittacus is remembered as one of the 7 sages of Greece, a ruler chosen by the people who advocated austerity and reform. He targeted the old aristocratic families, the ones who had grown rich on wine and trade and land. Sappho's family. Between 604 and 595 BC, she was sent into exile. The Parian Chronicle, our only ancient source for this, places her in Sicily during these years. Imagine that displacement. A woman raised in wealth and privilege, surrounded by culture and music, forced to leave everything she knew because of political conflicts she had no control over. Sicily was far from Lesbos across the Mediterranean, a different world. We don't know what she did there, how she lived, whether she wrote. The record is silent, but exile shaped her, must have. You don't spend years torn from your home without it changing how you see the world. At some point she returned to Lesbos. The political situation had shifted. She came back to Mytilene, the island's capital, and resumed her life. But what was that life exactly? This is where things get complicated, where centuries of speculation and wishful thinking have obscured what little evidence we actually have. According to a Byzantine encyclopedia called the Suda, compiled around the 10th century AD, Sappho was married to a man named Cerculus of Andros. Scholars now believe this was a joke. The name Cerculus is a diminutive of Kerkos, which can mean penis. Andros, besides being an island, is related to Ana, the Greek word for man. So the name essentially translates to Dick from the Isle of Man. Some ancient comic poet invented this, and later sources repeated it as fact. For centuries, people cited Sappho's husband, Dick from Man, as historical truth. This matters because it reveals how thoroughly later generations misunderstood or deliberately distorted who Sappho was. They needed her to fit conventional patterns. Married woman, mother, respectable. The poetry was too good to ignore, but the life had to be domesticated, made safe. She may have had a daughter named Cleis. 2 fragments reference this child, but even here, uncertainty creeps in. The word used, pais, can mean daughter, but it can also refer to a young beloved in other contexts. Some scholars think Cleis was Sappho's daughter. Others argue the relationship was different, more complex, harder to categorize using modern terms. What we can say with confidence is that Sappho gathered around her a community of young women. The Greeks called these communities thiasoi. They existed across Greece, particularly in Sparta, organized around religious and educational purposes. Girls came to these groups before marriage to learn music, poetry, dance, the arts of grace and seduction. They worshipped specific deities together. They formed intense emotional bonds. Sappho led one such thiasos on Lesbos. She wasn't the only one. 2 other women, Gorgo and Andromeda, led rival groups. We know their names only because Sappho's surviving fragments occasionally reference them, usually not favourably. Competition between these communities was real. For over a century, a particular narrative dominated scholarly understanding of Sappho's thiasos. A German classicist named Ulrich von Wilamowitz Merlendorf proposed in the late 19th century that Sappho ran a school for girls. She was a headmistress. The poetry reflected her pedagogical relationship with students. This interpretation conveniently explained away the intense eroticism in her work. Teacher and pupil, nothing more. The theory stuck because it was comfortable. It made Sappho respectable, but it was also, as later scholars pointed out, completely unsupported by evidence. None of Sappho's poetry mentions running a school. The thiasos wasn't an educational institution in the formal sense. It was a religious and social community organized around ritual, celebration, and yes, desire. Because here's what the poetry actually shows: intense homoerotic feeling between women. Not subtext, not metaphor, direct expression of physical and emotional desire. This isn't a modern interpretation imposed on ancient texts. Ancient readers recognized it too. By the late 6th century BC, the meaning of the word lesbian had already shifted from person from Lesbos to woman who prefers her own sex. That change happened while memories of Sappho were still relatively fresh. Fragment 31, one of her most famous poems, describes watching someone she loves talking with a man. The speaker's physical reaction is visceral. Her tongue fails, fire runs under her skin. She can't see, can't hear, sweat pours down, trembling seizes her. She turns greener than grass. She feels closer to death than to life. This isn't decorative language. It's the body in extremis, consumed by jealousy and desire. The Ode to Aphrodite, the only complete poem we have, addresses the goddess directly. Sappho asks Aphrodite to help her win over a woman who doesn't return her feelings. The goddess reminds Sappho that she's helped before, that the woman who now flees will soon pursue, that the one who doesn't accept gifts will soon give them, that the one who doesn't love will soon love even against her will. The poem assumes repeated cycles of desire and pursuit, a pattern familiar to anyone who's experienced unrequited longing. Some modern scholars have tried to complicate this reading. They argue we can't call Sappho a lesbian because she wouldn't have understood the term that way. They point out that ancient Greek sexuality didn't map onto modern categories. Glenn Most wrote that Sappho would have had no idea what we mean when we call her homosexual. André Lardinois called the question nonsensical. Page Dubois described it as a particularly obfuscating debate. These scholars aren't wrong about the historical differences in how sexuality was conceived. The ancient Greeks didn't think in terms of sexual orientation as identity, but the attempt to make Sappho's desire for women somehow ambiguous or uncertain, to refuse the label lesbian, often feels like another form of erasure. The poetry celebrates eros between women. Sandra Boehringer puts it simply, Sappho's works clearly celebrate eros between women. That clarity shouldn't be obscured by theoretical complications. The Thiassoi weren't just about desire, though. They were religious communities. Women in these groups worshipped together, performed rituals together, celebrated festivals. Aphrodite appears frequently in Sappho's fragments, as do the Graces and the Muses. The sacred and the erotic weren't separated the way later Christian thinking would separate them. Divine beauty and human beauty reflected each other. Worshipping Aphrodite meant honouring desire, pleasure, the body's capacity for joy. In these communities, girls learned to sing, to dance, to compose poetry, to move through the world with grace and confidence. They formed bonds that would last beyond their time in the Thiassos, beyond marriage, beyond the conventional structures that awaited them. Sappho's poetry often addresses women who have left, who have married and moved away. There's longing in these poems, but also memory, a sense of shared experience that distance can't erase. Fragment 16 begins with different people claiming different things. Our most beautiful. Some say cavalry, some infantry, some ships. But the speaker insists the most beautiful thing is whatever you love. She then invokes Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty launched 1,000 ships, who left husband and child to follow her desire. The poem connects personal longing to mythic precedent, suggesting that following desire, even when it disrupts social order, has its own legitimacy. This was radical. Not just the content, but the form. Sappho wrote in the first person, speaking directly about her own feelings, her own body, her own experiences. She didn't hide behind mythological narratives or abstract pronouncements. She said, I want, I remember, I feel. That directness, that refusal to universalize or distance emotion, was revolutionary. Her language combined elements from local Aeolic dialect with epic vocabulary from Homer. The phrasing was concise, direct, physically immediate. She could stand apart from her own emotions and examine them with critical clarity, but the emotions themselves lost nothing in that examination. Passion recollected in tranquility, centuries before Wordsworth coined the phrase. She invented a poetic meter that bears her name, the Sapphic stanza, 3 lines of 11 beats followed by a shorter line of 5. That structure, that rhythmic pattern, was copied by poets for the next 2,000 years. Catullus used it in Latin, Horace adapted it, English poets from the Renaissance onward experimented with it. The form itself became a carrier of her influence, spreading far beyond the fragments of her actual words. In her lifetime, Sappho was famous, not just respected, famous. Cities minted coins with her image. Statues were raised in her honor. When Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, heard a boy singing one of her songs, he supposedly asked to be taught it immediately, so he could learn it and die. Plato called her the 10th muse, adding her to the 9 divine inspirations of art. For centuries after her death, she was simply the poetess, just as Homer was the poet. But fame doesn't guarantee survival, and what happened next would determine whether those 10,000 lines of poetry reached future generations or vanished completely into the Mediterranean dust. The Alexandrian library changed everything. Around 280 BC, 3 centuries after Sappho's death, scholars in Egypt began a project that would determine whose words survived and whose disappeared. They were organizing Greek literature, creating definitive editions, establishing canons, Sappho made the cut. The scholars divided her work into 8 or 9 books. We're not entirely certain which, because ancient sources disagree. These books were organised by meter, each containing poems that shared the same rhythmic structure. The first 3 books each focused on a single metrical pattern. The organisation itself tells us something about how they understood her work, as primarily a technical achievement, a mastery of form worth preserving and studying. This Alexandrian edition became the standard text. Copies were made, shipped to libraries across the Mediterranean world. Rome got copies, Athens had them. Anywhere Greek culture reached, Sappho's poetry followed. For the next 700 years, her complete works existed, accessible to anyone who could read Greek and afford access to a library. But accessibility and survival are different things. The Alexandrian edition was written on papyrus scrolls. Papyrus degrades. It tears, gets eaten by insects, crumbles in humidity, burns easily. Every generation needed to make new copies, or the text would vanish. And for 7 centuries, people kept making those copies. Not because they were assigned to, because they wanted to, because the poetry mattered enough to justify the labour. The Romans fell in love with Sappho. Catullus, writing in the 1st century BC, adopted the Sapphic stanza for his own work. He gave his lover in his poetry the name Lesbia, a direct reference to Sappho's island. He translated Fragment 31, her poem about jealousy and desire, into Latin. His poem 51 is essentially Sappho's Fragment 31, wearing Roman clothes, speaking Latin instead of Greek, but keeping the emotional core intact. Other Roman poets followed. Horace experimented with Sapphic meter. Ovid referenced her. Even writers who didn't directly imitate her acknowledged her importance. She was the standard against which female poets were measured, the proof that women could achieve literary greatness. That mattered in a culture that generally dismissed women's intellectual capabilities. But the Roman reception wasn't uniformly positive. Horace called her mascula Sappho, masculine Sappho. Later commentators debated whether this was praise for her poetic achievement in a male-dominated field or criticism of her sexuality. Probably both. The Romans were fascinated by and uncomfortable with the homoeroticism in her work. They couldn't ignore it because it was too central to the poetry, but they also couldn't quite accept it on its own terms. By the 3rd century AD, 900 years after her death, cities were still minting coins with her image. Mytilene, the capital of Lesbos, proudly claimed her as their most famous citizen. The coin showed her portrait, her name, a lyre to indicate her identity as a poet. This wasn't just honouring a historical figure, this was claiming cultural authority, asserting that Lesbos had produced someone who mattered to the entire Greek-speaking world. Then Christianity arrived, and everything changed. The new religion viewed pagan literature with suspicion. Some texts could be tolerated because they contained useful philosophy or historical information. Homer survived because you needed him to understand classical culture. Plato survived because his ideas could be adapted to Christian theology. But lyric poetry celebrating erotic desire between women, that was harder to justify. The attack started early. Tatian, a Christian writer in the 2nd century, called Sappho a whore who sang about her own licentiousness. This wasn't literary criticism. This was moral condemnation. The poetry itself became evidence of depravity, something that needed to be suppressed rather than preserved. Other Christian authorities agreed. Saint Gregory of Nazianzus condemned her work. Pope Gregory VII, nearly 1,000 years after Tatian, supposedly ordered her writings burned. Whether he actually issued such an order is debated, but the story persisted because it seemed plausible. Of course, the church would want to destroy poetry that celebrated female desire, that placed women's experiences at the centre rather than the margins. But the real threat wasn't fire, it was indifference. Around the 7th century, something shifted. Sappho's poetry had survived longer than most of the other canonical Greek lyric poets. While their works vanished, hers kept getting copied. But by the 7th century, even that stopped. The transition from papyrus scrolls to parchment codices was part of the problem. The new format was better for preservation, but required active decisions about what to copy. You couldn't just transfer everything. You had to choose. And increasingly, people chose not to copy Sappho. Not necessarily because they hated her work, but because it wasn't useful anymore. It didn't teach Christian virtue. It didn't provide practical information. It was beautiful, but beauty wasn't enough. Around the 9th century, Byzantine scribes began using a new handwriting style, minuscule script, which was more compact and efficient than the older uncial letters. This required copying texts again into the new format. It was another decision point, another opportunity to let things disappear. And with Sappho, that's exactly what happened. There's no evidence her work was ever copied into minuscule script. The last generation of readers who had access to her complete poetry existed sometime in the 8th or 9th century. After that, nothing. Well, almost nothing. Quotations survived. Ancient literary critics had included lines from Sappho in their works to illustrate points about meter, language, or style. These quotations got copied along with the critical texts that contained them. So you'd have a treatise on Greek meter preserved in a Byzantine library, and buried in the middle of it, 4 lines of Sappho, quoted to demonstrate the Sapphic stanza. Occasionally, an ancient author would quote a complete poem. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC about literary composition, included the full text of the Ode to Aphrodite to demonstrate Sappho's skill. His treatise survived when her poetry didn't, so that one complete poem made it through, not because anyone cared about preserving Sappho specifically, but because scholars wanted to preserve Dionysius's analysis. These scattered quotations were all that remained accessible for over 1,000 years. Medieval and Renaissance scholars knew Sappho existed. They knew she'd been considered great. They had fragments, tantalizing glimpses, but the overwhelming majority of her work was gone, vanished somewhere between the 9th century and the Renaissance, lost in the transition from one writing technology to another, casualties of changing tastes and religious attitudes. The fragments that survived shaped how later generations understood her. Without access to her complete works, people filled in the gaps with imagination and prejudice. Medieval writers knew she was a famous female poet from Lesbos. They knew she wrote about love. They had a few fragments that mentioned women. From this, they constructed narratives. One persistent legend claimed she fell in love with a ferryman named Phaon, who rejected her, leading her to throw herself from the Leucadian cliffs. This story appears nowhere in her surviving poetry. It probably originated in Greek comedy, where writers invented absurd scenarios about real people for laughs. But without her actual work to contradict it, the legend stuck. It served a purpose. It made her comprehensible to audiences uncomfortable with the idea of a woman who loved women. She became a tragic romantic figure, dying for unrequited heterosexual love, safely contained within conventional narratives. The real Sappho, the one who wrote about desire for women with unprecedented directness, faded behind this invented version. Renaissance scholars knew better, or should have. They had access to ancient literary criticism that discussed her work more accurately. But the Phaon legend was dramatic, tragic, easy to depict in art. Paintings showed her leaping from cliffs, eyes fixed on the distant ship carrying her beloved. It was nonsense, but it was compelling nonsense. Meanwhile, the actual manuscripts were rotting in Egyptian garbage dumps. Literally. Ancient Egypt used papyrus for everything. When documents became obsolete, they were discarded. Over centuries, these dumps accumulated layers of papyrus trash. The dry climate preserved it in ways that wouldn't have worked anywhere else. In humid regions, organic materials decay. In Egypt's desert climate, they desiccate and survive. Nobody knew this treasure existed. The dumps were just piles of ancient garbage in the sand, occasionally raided by locals looking for fertilizer. The papyri they contained, if anyone noticed them at all, seemed like worthless scraps. Who cared about documents written in dead languages, torn and faded and fragmentary? Then in the late 19th century, archaeologists started paying attention. Excavations near Oxyrhynchus, a Greek-Egyptian town, began turning up papyri by the thousands. Most were mundane: tax records, personal letters, shopping lists, legal contracts, the everyday documentation of ancient life. But mixed in with the administrative debris were literary texts, fragments of Homer, lost plays by Greek dramatists, and incredibly, pieces of Sappho. The first discoveries happened in 1897. Two British archaeologists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, started excavating garbage dumps at Oxyrhynchus. They weren't looking for Sappho specifically, they were looking for anything. But when they started sorting through what they'd found, there she was. Lines of poetry in archaic Greek, written in the meters described in ancient literary criticism. The handwriting dated the manuscripts to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, over 800 years after Sappho's death, but still ancient enough to potentially preserve accurate texts. The fragments were in terrible condition, torn, faded. Sometimes just a few words per line were legible. The papyrus had been reused, written over, turned into cartonnage for mummy cases or packing material for coffins. One scholar who worked on transcribing these fragments lost his eyesight from the strain. Another temporarily lost his sanity. The work required reading faded ink on damaged papyrus, often with crucial words missing, trying to reconstruct meaning from context and knowledge of Greek meter. But they were Sappho's words. After more than 1,000 years of having only scattered quotations preserved in other authors' works, suddenly there were new fragments. Not complete poems mostly, but substantial pieces, enough to get a sense of her range, her themes, the emotional landscape of her work. More discoveries followed. In 1914, archaeologists found papier-mâché coffins made from papyrus scraps. Ancient Egyptian undertakers had used whatever paper was available, including documents written in Greek. When scholars carefully separated the layers of these coffins, they found more Sappho fragments. The dead had been buried wrapped in her poetry, their bodies preserved by words written 1,000 years before their own deaths. The discoveries continued through the 20th century. Each new find generated excitement in classical scholarship. A few more lines, a previously unknown poem. Sometimes just single words, but even those mattered because they confirmed or challenged assumptions about her vocabulary and style. The fragments were puzzles, tantalizing glimpses of something larger that remained mostly hidden. What emerged from these fragments was consistent with what ancient critics had said about her work, but more vivid. The poetry was immediate, physical, emotionally direct. Fragment 31, one of the more complete pieces, describes watching someone else talking and laughing with the woman the speaker loves. The physical symptoms of jealousy and desire are catalogued with precision. Tongue breaking, fire running under skin, eyes unable to see, ears roaring, sweat pouring, trembling, turning paler than grass. That level of physical detail, that willingness to describe the body's response to desire without shame or distance, was revolutionary. It remained revolutionary even when rediscovered 2,000 years later. The poem influenced modern poetry as much as it had influenced ancient. It demonstrated what language could do when turned toward embodied experience rather than abstract concepts. Fragment 16 became one of the most analysed pieces. It opens with different people claiming different things are most beautiful: cavalry, infantry, ships. But the speaker insists the most beautiful thing is whatever you love. Then Helen of Troy appears, the woman who abandoned everything for desire. The poem doesn't condemn her, it uses her as evidence that following desire, even when it disrupts social order, has its own logic, its own legitimacy. These fragments revealed a poet who thought deeply about desire, about beauty, about the relationship between the two, who understood that attraction wasn't rational, couldn't be commanded or controlled, but was nonetheless real and powerful enough to shape lives. The mythology was falling away, replaced by something more interesting, a complex intelligence wrestling with experiences that remain recognizable across millennia. But the fragments also revealed how much was lost. Every new piece of Sappho discovered made the absence of the rest more painful. We had glimpses, we could see that there had been something extraordinary here, but we couldn't access it fully. The complete poems, the books organized by meter, the 10,000 lines that ancient readers knew, all of that was gone. What remained were scraps rescued from garbage dumps and coffin materials, preserved by accident rather than intention. The 21st century brought two discoveries that changed everything, not just for Sappho scholarship, but for how we understand the relationship between past and present, between loss and recovery. In 2004, scholars announced the discovery of what they called the Tithonus poem. It wasn't completely new. A few lines had been known before, quoted in an ancient treatise, but now there were more stanzas, enough to see the complete arc of thought. The poem addresses aging with a directness that still feels startling. It mentions Tithonus, the mythical figure granted immortality but not eternal youth, condemned to age forever. The speaker's own aging body becomes the subject. Grey hair, knees that won't dance, skin that was once soft. These aren't abstractions. They're observations made by someone watching their own body change, feeling the difference between what was and what is. The discovery generated international news coverage. Major newspapers ran stories. The BBC covered it. This wasn't just academic interest. People responded to the poem because it addressed something universal. The experience of aging, of watching yourself become someone different from who you were. The poem doesn't offer comfort or wisdom about aging. It just records the fact of it, the strangeness of inhabiting a body that keeps changing without your consent. What made the Tithonus poem particularly valuable was that it showed Sappho thinking about mortality in personal terms, rather than mythological ones. Ancient poetry often used myths as frameworks for human experience. This poem does that too, invoking Tithonus. But then it shifts to the immediate, the physical, the speaker's own experience. The myth becomes a way to think about something happening right now, in this body, at this moment. 10 years later came something even more unexpected. In 2014, scholars announced the discovery of what became known as the Brothers poem. This one was completely unknown. No ancient source had ever quoted it. No fragment had survived in previous discoveries. It appeared in a papyrus collection that had been held privately, then sold at auction, then studied by scholars who recognized what they had. The poem mentions Charaxos and Larichos, names that ancient sources listed as Sappho's brothers, but that had never appeared in her surviving work. Before this discovery, scholars had debated whether Sappho actually wrote about her family. Maybe those ancient biographical details were inventions, stories created to explain poems that were actually fictional. The Brothers poem confirmed that she did write about her family, that those names were real references, not later fabrications. But the content was what really mattered. The speaker addresses someone, probably another family member, who keeps saying that Charaxos will return with his ship full of goods. The speaker pushes back against this certainty. How can you know what the gods will do? Human knowledge has limits. The future isn't ours to predict. Then the poem shifts to prayer, asking that Larichos will mature, will become a man, will help the family escape its troubles. It's a family poem. Domestic concerns, one brother away on a trading voyage that might succeed or fail. Another brother, still young, not yet the man he needs to become. the speaker caught between hope and worry, between what she wants to believe and what she knows she can't control. This wasn't the Sappho of mythological grandeur or erotic intensity. This was someone dealing with ordinary family anxiety, the kind that transcends centuries, because families still work this way. We still worry about siblings. We still hope young family members will grow into their potential. We still can't control outcomes, no matter how much we want to. The discovery process itself was controversial. The papyrus fragments had been in private hands. They were sold to collectors rather than going directly to academic institutions. Some scholars questioned whether buying such materials encouraged looting of archaeological sites. Others argued that private collectors had preserved these fragments when they might otherwise have been lost. The ethics of antiquities markets, the question of who owns ancient texts, the tension between academic access and private ownership. All of these became part of the story. But the poem was real. Multiple scholars verified it. The handwriting matched other papyri from the period. The dialect was right. The meter was Sapphic. The content fit with what ancient sources had said about her family. This was actually Sappho, recovered from silence after 2,500 years. What both discoveries revealed was how much we still don't know. Each new fragment changes the picture slightly. The Tithonus poem added aging to the list of topics Sappho addressed. The brothers' poem added family anxiety, domestic concerns, the everyday worries that occupied her when she wasn't writing about desire or beauty or the gods. These weren't the subjects that ancient critics focused on when they praised her. They talked about her love poetry, her emotional intensity, her ability to capture physical desire in language. The new discoveries suggested her range was wider than the surviving fragments had indicated. They also revealed how random survival is. These poems survived because someone in ancient Egypt used papyrus for trash, for building material, for whatever purpose left it buried in conditions dry enough to preserve it. Other poems, probably equally good or better, were lost because the papyrus they were written on ended up somewhere wet, somewhere it decomposed, somewhere it was burned or recycled or destroyed. The survival of ancient texts isn't about quality, it's about luck, geography, climate, random chance. Scholars studying the new fragments noticed something else. The papyrus itself could be dated, analysed, understood as a historical object separate from the text it contained. The Cologne papyrus containing the Tithonus poem dated to the 3rd century BC, making it the oldest surviving fragment of Sappho we have. Someone copied this poem 700 years before the manuscript culture that preserved most classical texts. Someone thought it was worth copying, worth preserving, worth passing on. Then it was lost, then it was buried, then it survived in conditions that destroyed countless other texts, then it was found. The process of studying these fragments was painstaking. Papyrus survives in terrible condition. It's brittle, faded, torn. Letters are missing. Words are incomplete. Sometimes you can make out individual characters, but not full words. Sometimes you can reconstruct words from context, but can't be certain. The scholars working on this material have to know ancient Greek deeply enough to recognize patterns, to fill gaps based on meter and syntax and dialect. They have to be detectives, working with incomplete evidence, building arguments about what probably stood in the missing spaces. And they argue. Scholarly consensus on these fragments isn't universal. Different experts propose different readings of damaged sections. They debate whether certain words should be reconstructed one way or another, whether certain passages should be interpreted literally or metaphorically, whether certain pronouns refer to people or gods or abstract concepts. The fragments don't come with definitive answers. They come with possibilities, with multiple valid interpretations, with ongoing debates that may never be fully resolved. What's clear is that every discovery, however small, matters. A single new word can confirm or challenge assumptions about Sappho's vocabulary. A new line can reveal something about her meter, her imagery, her concerns. The fragments are pieces of a puzzle that can never be completed, but each piece changes how we understand the whole, or the absence of the whole, or what the whole might have been if it had survived. The 2004 and 2014 discoveries also changed the public conversation about Sappho. News coverage brought her to audiences who might never read academic scholarship. People who had never heard of her learned that an ancient Greek poet's work was still being discovered, still being read, still mattering enough to make international news. The discoveries became cultural events, not just academic ones. They also sparked discussions about what we've lost. If fragments keep appearing after 2,000 years, what else might still be out there? What papyri are sitting in private collections, unexamined? What ancient garbage dumps haven't been excavated? What libraries or monasteries might contain manuscripts that haven't been properly catalogued? The discoveries raised possibilities even as they emphasized absence. Because here's what we know. 10,000 lines reduced to 650. 9 books reduced to fragments. A complete body of work that ancient readers studied, memorized, quoted, argued about, all of it mostly gone. What survives is enough to show us what we're missing. Every fragment is a reminder of everything that isn't there. The Tithonus poem and Brothers poem didn't just add to Sappho's corpus. They changed how scholars thought about the relationship between the surviving fragments and the lost whole. If these poems could appear after being completely unknown, what other complete poems might still exist somewhere, waiting to be found? What might the next discovery reveal? The answer is we don't know. That's the point. The archive isn't closed. New fragments could appear tomorrow or never. The randomness of survival means anything is possible. What we have isn't fixed. It's contingent, temporary, subject to change, based on what archaeology uncovers next. This uncertainty defines the entire field of fragmentary classics. You work with what exists while knowing it's incomplete. You build arguments knowing new evidence could undermine them. You interpret texts knowing crucial context is missing. You accept that definitive answers aren't available, that ambiguity is permanent, that the questions will always exceed the answers, but the fragments we have, however incomplete, however damaged, however random their survival, they still work. They still communicate across the void of time. They still show us someone thinking about desire, about beauty, about aging, about family, about the gods, about everything that occupied human attention then and occupies it now. The incompleteness is frustrating, but what remains is enough to show why Sappho mattered, why she still matters, why her voice continues to speak even in fragments. The fragments also changed how we think about ancient Greek sexuality itself. Before the major discoveries, scholars worked with limited evidence about how desire functioned in Sappho's world. Fragment 31, the one describing physical symptoms of attraction, was powerful but isolated. The newer fragments added context, showed patterns, revealed a wider landscape of emotional expression. They didn't settle debates about Sappho's sexuality. They complicated those debates, which is actually more valuable, because the question, was Sappho gay, assumes modern categories apply to ancient experience. The Greeks didn't think in terms of sexual orientation as identity. They thought about desire, about acts, about social roles. The word lesbian comes from Lesbos, from Sappho's island, but the meaning evolved over centuries in ways Sappho herself couldn't have predicted. She lived in a world with different frameworks for understanding attraction between women. Her poetry describes intense feelings for female subjects. That's undeniable. Whether she acted on those feelings, whether they were reciprocated, whether they were physical or purely emotional, these questions matter less than what the poetry actually does. It creates language for desire that hadn't existed before. It makes certain experiences visible, expressible, worthy of art. The The fragments show someone thinking carefully about beauty, about longing, about the physical effects of attraction. Fragment 31 is famous partly because it's so specific. The person watching someone else talk and laugh with another person experiences a cascade of physical symptoms. Tongue breaks, fire races under skin, eyes can't see, ears roar, sweat pours, trembling takes over. The speaker becomes greener than grass, seems nearly dead. This isn't abstract. This is a body responding to desire with overwhelming force. Other fragments are gentler but equally direct. Fragment 96 describes someone walking among Lydian women like the moon surpassing stars. Fragment 16 argues that the most beautiful thing isn't cavalry or infantry or ships, but whatever you love. These aren't theoretical statements. They're assertions about desire's primacy, about how attraction reorganizes perception, makes one person or thing more valuable than anything else. The brothers' poem added a different dimension. It showed Sappho worrying about family, about her brother Charaxos returning safely from a trading voyage, about her other brother Lyricos becoming a man. The personal voice isn't only concerned with desire, it's also concerned with ordinary family anxieties, with practical matters, with hoping for good outcomes in situations beyond anyone's control. This matters because it prevents Sappho from being reduced to a single theme. Yes, she wrote about desire. She also wrote about family, about gods, about flowers and evening and music. The fragments that survive are biased towards certain subjects because later writers quoted what interested them. Ancient grammarians preserved lines that illustrated unusual dialect forms. Christian writers sometimes quoted her to criticize her morals. Romantic passages were copied because they were beautiful. But the original corpus, the 10,000 lines, must have contained enormous variety. Religious hymns, wedding songs, poems for public occasions, personal reflections, observations about nature, comments on politics. The fragments we have are samples, not a representative collection. They show us what survival bias looks like. What got quoted, what got written on papyrus that ended up in Egypt, what happened to be used as mummy wrapping. This randomness shaped what endured. So when we read Sappho, we're reading accident and intention simultaneously. She intended to write these poems. She didn't intend for them to survive in this form. Scattered, incomplete, sometimes reduced to single words. The survival was accidental, determined by forces she couldn't have imagined. Desert climate, burial practices, scholarly interests, religious censorship, all of it beyond her control. Yet the voice remains recognizable across the damage. Even in fragments of a few words, you can hear distinctive qualities: directness, precision, emotional intensity without melodrama. She doesn't overwrite. She doesn't explain too much. She trusts the image, the detail, the gesture to carry meaning. Fragment 105 is just 2 words in Greek, like the sweet apple that reddens on the branch top. On the top of the topmost branch, the apple gatherers forgot it. No, they didn't forget it. They couldn't reach it. That's it. A ripe apple on the highest branch, unreachable. The fragment breaks off. But you understand what it's describing. Something desirable that can't be obtained. Something perfect that remains untouched because of distance or difficulty. The image does everything. It doesn't need explanation. You see the apple bright against leaves, impossibly high. You understand immediately what this represents. Desire for something out of reach. The fragment's incompleteness almost enhances it. The thought trails off, leaves you with the image, with the longing it implies. Fragment 168b is even shorter. The moon has set and the Pleiades, midnight. Time passes. I lie alone. 5 lines, maybe 6 depending on reconstruction. But the loneliness is absolute. The astronomical details mark time passing. The speaker is awake, alone, aware of time moving while she remains solitary. The brevity intensifies it. These tiny fragments demonstrate something crucial about Sappho's technique. She works through concrete images, specific details, precise observations. She doesn't abstract, she doesn't generalize. She shows you the moon setting, the apple unreachable, the physical symptoms of desire, and trusts you to understand what they mean. This approach influenced poetry for the next 2,000 years. The focus on images, on showing rather than telling, on trusting readers to make connections. This became fundamental to lyric poetry. Sappho didn't invent it, but she perfected it in ways that later poets studied and imitated. The Sapphic stanza, the metrical pattern she used, also survived. 3 lines of 11 syllables followed by a line of 5. The rhythm is distinctive, slightly asymmetrical, falling at the end in a way that feels like resolution. Greek and Latin poets used it. Medieval poets adapted it. Renaissance writers revived it. Modern poets still experiment with it. The meter carries associations now. When you write in Sapphic stanzas, you're invoking Sappho, deliberately connecting your work to hers. The form has become inseparable from her name, from her themes, from the fragments that survive. It's a ghost of her complete work, a pattern that outlasted the poems it originally structured. But the influence goes beyond technical elements. Sappho changed what poetry could be about. Before her, Greek poetry was mostly epic, concerned with heroes, battles, gods, public events. Sappho turned poetry inward, made it explore personal feeling, individual experience, private moments. She made the subjective worthy of artistic attention. This sounds obvious now. Modern poetry is mostly concerned with individual consciousness, personal experience, subjective response. But someone had to demonstrate that this territory was worth exploring, that private feelings could generate art as powerful as public narratives. Sappho did that. She made the personal universal by showing how individual experience connects to larger patterns. When she describes desire's physical effects, she's describing something specific to her moment, her situation, her body. But she's also describing something anyone who's experienced intense attraction recognizes. The specificity becomes universal. The individual becomes representative. This is how lyric poetry works, and Sappho was among the first to fully realize its possibilities. The fragments also show technical mastery. The language is precise, economical, musical. Aeolic Greek, the dialect Sappho wrote in, has particular sonic qualities, softer than Attic, more vowel sounds, different rhythms. Reading Sappho in Greek, even fragmentary Greek, reveals how carefully she crafted sound patterns. English translations can't fully capture this. The music is lost in translation, the specific sounds, the way words echo each other, the rhythmic subtleties. What remains is structure, imagery, emotional content. But the sonic dimension, the reason these poems were sung with lyre accompaniment, that's mostly inaccessible to non-Greek readers. This creates a fundamental problem. Most people encountering Sappho read translations. They're reading interpretations, reconstructions, attempts to convey something that exists primarily as sound and rhythm in a dead language. The translations are valuable, necessary, often beautiful. But they're not Sappho. They're responses to Sappho, versions of Sappho, translations of fragments of Sappho. The distance is enormous. Original poems, complete in Aeolic Greek, sung to music, performed for specific audiences, became fragments, reconstructed, translated, printed, read silently. Every step moves further from the original experience, yet something survives the journey. The core remains recognizable, even through all the transformations. This resilience suggests something essential about the work. It's not just beautiful sounds in a specific language. It's also ideas, images, emotions that translate across time and language. The apple on the highest branch works in any language. The physical symptoms of desire remain comprehensible across cultures. The loneliness of lying awake alone transcends historical specificity. So Sappho survives not despite the fragments, but through them. The incompleteness forces readers to engage actively, to fill gaps, to imagine what's missing. Complete poems might be admired, studied, appreciated. Fragments demand participation. They require readers to become collaborators, co-creators, partners in meaning-making. Every reconstruction is interpretation. Every translation is creation. Every reading of Sappho involves building something from ruins, making wholeness from pieces, finding patterns in remnants. This active engagement keeps her work alive in ways that perfect preservation might not. The fragments are also democratic in a strange way. Because so much is missing, readers from different backgrounds, different times, different perspectives can find different things. The gaps allow for multiple interpretations, diverse readings, ongoing conversations. If the complete corpus survived, it might be more fixed, more settled, less open to reinterpretation. The fragments resist closure. They don't resolve into single meanings. They remain open, suggestive, productive of endless commentary and debate. This openness is partly accident, the result of physical destruction, but it's also become the work's defining characteristic. Sappho means fragments. Fragments mean possibility, multiplicity, ongoing discovery. And discoveries continue. The 2014 findings weren't the last. In 2018, papyrus fragments in a private collection revealed more lines from the brothers' poem. In 2021, researchers using new imaging technology found previously invisible text on papyri already in collections. The archive keeps yielding surprises. Each discovery changes the landscape slightly. A new word might confirm a hypothesis or undermine it. A new line might clarify a reference or complicate it. The fragments are unstable, constantly being reread, reconsidered, recontextualized. What we know about Sappho is always provisional, always subject to revision based on what might be found next. This uncertainty defines classical scholarship generally, but it's especially acute with Sappho. The ratio of lost to surviving is so extreme. The fragments are so compelling. The desire for more is so intense. Every discovery feels like a gift and a reminder of everything still missing. Every new fragment raises hopes that the next find might be even more substantial, even more revealing. The hope is understandable but probably misplaced. The major finds have likely already happened. Oxyrhynchus has been excavated. Most major papyrus collections have been digitized and examined. New imaging technologies might reveal previously invisible text on known fragments, but the chances of discovering substantial new poems are slim. The garbage dumps of Egypt have been picked through. What remains are private collections, unprovenanced fragments, pieces that might surface through the antiquities market. Occasionally, something appears, but expecting another complete poem or a substantial portion of a lost book isn't realistic. What we have is probably what we'll get, which raises uncomfortable questions about interpretation built on absence. When scholars debate Sappho's biography, her relationships, her beliefs, they're working from fragments that represent maybe 6% of her total output. Building comprehensive theories from such limited evidence is inherently problematic. You're reconstructing a building from scattered bricks. The shape you create reflects your assumptions as much as the original structure. Take the question of her sexuality. The fragments clearly express desire for women. Fragment 31, the poem describing physical symptoms when watching someone talk and laugh, is explicitly about female beauty. Fragment 16 says Helen was right to abandon everything for love, because desire is irresistible. These aren't subtle. The homoeroticism is present. But how much can we infer about Sappho's life from poems that might be fictional, performative, conventional within a genre we don't fully understand? The tendency is to read the fragments as autobiography, and we assume that's Sappho herself speaking from personal experience. But lyric poetry doesn't work that way. Not always, not necessarily. A poet can adopt personas, imagine scenarios, work within conventions that have nothing to do with lived experience. When a male poet writes love poetry to a woman, we don't automatically assume biographical truth. Why do we treat Sappho differently? Partly because we want to. The fragments seem personal, intimate, immediate. They feel like direct access to inner life. And in the absence of other information about ancient women's emotional and sexual experiences, Sappho becomes representative, symbolic, crucial. She's one of the few female voices surviving from the ancient world. The pressure to make her mean something, to extract maximum significance from minimal evidence, is enormous. The Thiassos theory emerged partly from this pressure. If Sappho wrote about young women, she must have been their teacher. If she expressed desire for them, it must have been pedagogical, initiation rites, socially sanctioned homoeroticism within educational contexts. This makes her sexuality acceptable, explainable, contained within proper social structures. It removes the threatening possibility that she was just a woman writing about wanting other women outside any institutional framework. The evidence for the Thiassos is thin. None of Sappho's surviving fragments mention it. Ancient sources don't describe it. The entire construction rests on comparative evidence from Sparta and assumptions about how aristocratic girls were educated. It might be true, or it might be scholars projecting what they need to believe to make Sappho fit acceptable categories. We don't know. The fragments don't tell us. What they do tell us, with absolute clarity, is that someone wrote extraordinarily beautiful poetry about desire, loss, beauty, memory, and the gods. That poetry was preserved because it was recognized as exceptional. It survived partial destruction, cultural transformation, religious censorship, linguistic change, and technological shift from oral performance to written text, to print, to digital. That's the fact that matters. The biographical details, while fascinating, are secondary to the work itself. And the work, even in fragments, even in translation, even stripped of music and performance context, remains powerful. Fragment 31 still communicates the physical reality of desire. Fragment 16 still captures the pull of love against duty. The apple fragment still evokes the beautiful and unattainable. These images work across time and culture because they're rooted in human experience that doesn't fundamentally change. Bodies still respond to desire the same way. People still choose love over obligation. Beautiful things still remain out of reach. Sappho's influence on later poetry is substantial but complicated to trace. Roman poets like Catullus and Horace adopted her meters and themes. They referenced her explicitly, paid homage, imitated her style. Catullus even translated Fragment 31 into Latin. But they were working from complete texts we no longer have. Their Sappho was different from ours, more complete, more contextualized. When medieval and Renaissance poets rediscovered Sappho, they encountered something closer to what we have now. Fragments, pieces, hints of what had been. The Sapphic stanza survived as a formal structure, even when the poems themselves were lost. Poets used the meter without necessarily understanding the content. The form became detached from its origin, a technical exercise, a way to demonstrate classical learning. Some poets, particularly women poets, claimed Sappho as a predecessor, a model, proof that women could write serious poetry. But they often had to defend her against accusations of immorality. Sappho's reputation in later periods oscillated between reverence for her artistry and discomfort with her sexuality. The Victorian period particularly struggled with this. They admired Greek culture but needed it to be morally pure. Sappho presented a problem. Her fragments were too explicit to ignore, too beautiful to dismiss, too valuable to classical studies to abandon. The solution was to explain her desire as something other than what it appeared to be. Scholarly affection, pedagogical warmth, conventional poetic tropes, anything except actual sexual desire for women. This required creative reading, selective translation, and willful misinterpretation. Fragment 31 became about admiration of virtue. The physical symptoms were aesthetic appreciation. The context was educational. The gymnastics were impressive. By the 20th century, this became unsustainable. The fragments were too clear. The EVDA, NC too strong. Sappho wrote about desiring women. Accept it or reject the poems entirely. Most scholars accepted it, though debates continued about terminology and historical context. The question shifted from whether Sappho was homosexual to whether using modern terms like lesbian or homosexual made sense for an ancient Greek poet who lived in a completely different cultural framework for understanding sexuality. This debate reveals something important about how we use the past. Sappho matters to contemporary discussions about sexuality because she provides historical precedent, evidence that same-sex desire isn't modern invention or Western decadence. She's claimed as an ancestor, a forerunner, proof of continuity, but this instrumentalization risks distorting what the fragments actually show. Sappho wrote in a specific cultural context with different assumptions about gender, sexuality, marriage, and social organization. Her experience wasn't identical to modern lesbian experience. The differences matter as much as the similarities. Using her as simple validation ignores historical specificity. Yet the desire for connection, for lineage, for evidence that people like us existed in the past is legitimate and powerful. Sappho provides that evidence. She's one of the few places where we can see ancient female desire expressed in a woman's voice. That makes her invaluable, even if the connection is complicated, even if the fragments don't give us everything we want. The fragments also matter for what they show about poetry itself, about what language can do. Sappho's style is distinctive, even in translation. Short words, simple syntax, concrete images, minimal abstraction. She doesn't explain feelings, she shows physical manifestations. The trembling, the speechlessness, the cold sweat. She doesn't describe beauty in general terms, she gives you specific details. The apple on the branch, the purple cloth, the girl's laughter. This directness, this precision, this trust in image over explanation became foundational to lyric poetry. Later poets learned from this. The modernist emphasis on concrete imagery, on showing rather than telling, on trusting the reader to make connections, all of this has roots in Sappho's technique. Ezra Pound's imagism, H.D.'s fragments, even contemporary poetry's tendency toward brevity and suggestion rather than elaboration, these connect to Sapphic aesthetics, not through direct influence necessarily, but through a shared understanding of how poetry works most effectively. The fragments also demonstrate something about how art survives. Complete works can be admired, studied, preserved carefully. Fragments force engagement. They demand interpretation. They resist passive consumption. Reading Sappho requires work, imagination, participation. You have to fill gaps, make connections, decide what words might be missing. This active reading creates investment. The fragments become partly yours because you've had to complete them in your mind. This might explain their endurance. They're not finished objects to be appreciated from a distance. They're ongoing puzzles, permanent questions, inexhaustible sources of possibility. Each reader, each translator, each scholar creates a slightly different Sappho based on how they fill the gaps. All these Sapphos coexist. None is definitive. The original is lost. So what remains is this multiplicity, this chorus of voices all responding to the same fragmentary evidence in different ways. That's not a failure of scholarship. It's the condition of the work. Sappho exists now primarily as interpretation, as response, as ongoing conversation about what these pieces mean and how they fit together. And then there's the question of what gets lost when fragments become the primary mode of encounter. Reading Sappho means reading incompleteness. You never get the full poem, the complete thought, the finished structure. Every fragment cuts off mid-sentence, mid-image, mid-emotion. This creates a particular aesthetic experience, one that privileges suggestion over statement, implication over declaration. But it's not what Sappho intended. She wrote complete poems. They had beginnings, middles, and ends. They developed arguments, told stories, created emotional arcs that resolved. We don't have any of that except in the Ode to Aphrodite. Everything else is interrupted transmission, partial signal, broken message. This matters because the fragmentary nature has become so associated with Sappho that it's hard to imagine her work any other way. The brokenness feels essential, part of the aesthetic rather than an accident of preservation. Modern poets deliberately imitate the fragmentary style, creating poems that look like ancient papyrus, complete with brackets and ellipses and gaps. But that's not imitating Sappho's poetry. That's imitating what happened to her poetry over 2,000 years. The actual poems, when she wrote them, were whole. They had 7 stanzas, or 12, or however many the composition required. They moved from invocation through development to conclusion. They satisfied metrical requirements, fulfilled generic expectations, achieved closure. Reading them would have been a different experience entirely. Not this haunting incompleteness, this pregnant silence, this modernist fragmentation before modernism existed. Just finished lyric poems, elegant and complete. We can't recover that experience. Too much is gone. But recognizing the difference matters, because it prevents us from romanticizing the loss, from treating destruction as aesthetic choice. The fragments are beautiful, partly because they're fragments, because the gaps force our imagination to activate, because we participate in creating meaning. But that's making the best of catastrophic loss, not celebrating intentional design. Consider fragment 16, one of the longer surviving pieces. It opens with a catalogue of what different people consider most beautiful. Some say cavalry, some infantry, some ships. But I say, it's whatever you love. Then it pivots to Helen of Troy as example, the most beautiful woman who left everything for love. The fragment breaks off while still developing this argument. We don't get the conclusion, the return to the opening theme, the final statement about the beloved that presumably completed the thought. Without the ending, the poem feels modern, elliptical, trusting the reader to complete the logic. With the ending, it would have been more conventional, more clearly structured, more rhetorically complete. Which version is better? Impossible to say since we only have one. But the fragmentary version has influenced modern poetry in ways the complete version might not have. The incompleteness creates power through what's unsaid. Or, take fragment 31, the poem that describes physical symptoms of desire. Tongue breaks, fire runs under skin, eyes see nothing, ears roar. It's visceral, immediate, overwhelming, but it also breaks off. We don't know if there was a final stanza that reflected on these symptoms, that interpreted them, that contextualized them within some larger framework. Maybe the poem just catalogued sensations and stopped. Or maybe there was more, a turn toward resolution or understanding or prayer. The fragment gives us intensity without closure, which feels very contemporary, but that might be accidental rather than intentional. This uncertainty extends to almost everything about Sappho's work. We don't know what meters she used for most poems because we don't have enough consecutive lines. We don't know how she structured longer compositions because we don't have any complete longer compositions. We don't know her range because we're missing most of what she wrote. The 9 books of poetry, organized by meter according to Alexandrian editors, contained thousands of lines. We have fragments of some poems from some books. The rest is silence. What survives represents maybe 7% of her total output. And that 7% is weighted towards certain types of poems because of how survival happened. Love poetry got quoted more often by later authors interested in emotional expression. Religious hymns and family poems and occasional pieces for public performance, these had less quotable content, fewer memorable lines that later writers wanted to reference, so they disappeared more completely. The Sappho we have is already filtered through ancient editorial choices about what was worth preserving, then filtered again through medieval copying practices, then filtered again through the random survival of papyri. Each filtering changed the picture. The Alexandrian editors selected and organized based on their criteria. Medieval copyists preserved what interested them or what their patrons requested. Papyri survived or didn't based on environmental conditions in Egyptian garbage dumps. None of this was designed to give us a representative sample of Sappho's work. We got what accident and various biases allowed to survive. This means making any general statement about Sappho's poetry is risky. When we say she focused primarily on love and desire, we're describing the fragments that survived, not necessarily her actual emphasis. Maybe she wrote just as much religious poetry, but those pieces didn't get quoted as often and didn't survive on papyrus. Maybe she wrote extensive political commentary that disappeared completely because later editors found it less interesting. We can't know. The evidence isn't there. What we can say is that the surviving fragments reveal an extraordinary poetic intelligence at work. The language is precise, controlled, economical. Nothing is wasted. Every word carries weight. The images are concrete rather than abstract, grounded in physical detail rather than philosophical generalization. She shows rather than tells, trusts the specific instance to convey larger meaning. This technical mastery is visible even in tiny fragments. Fragment 105 consists of 2 words in Greek describing the moon setting. That's all. 2 words, but they create an image, establish a mood, suggest a context. The economy is remarkable. Later poets would take paragraphs to accomplish what Sappho does in 2 words. This compression, this ability to pack enormous meaning into minimal language, became one of her signature techniques. It's also what makes translation so difficult. In Greek, a single word can carry implications that require whole phrases in English. The grammar allows meanings that English grammar can't replicate. The sound patterns, the meter, the music of the language, none of this transfers cleanly. Every translation is interpretation. Every interpretation is partial. Multiple valid translations can coexist because the original contains possibilities that no single English version can exhaust. This multiplicity of translation mirrors the multiplicity of the fragments themselves. Just as different translators create different versions of the same Greek text, different scholars create different understandings of what the fragments meant in their original context. All these versions exist simultaneously, none definitive, all provisional. And then there's the question of performance. Sappho's poems were meant to be sung, accompanied by the lyre. The music is completely lost. We don't know the melodies, the rhythms, how the words interacted with the musical line. Reading Sappho silently on a page is like reading opera libretto without the music. You get the words, but you're missing half the art. Ancient sources describe her performing, mention her teaching others to perform her work, reference the emotional impact of hearing these poems sung. None of that is recoverable. We have the lyrics without the music, the text without the performance, the script without the staging. It's better than nothing, but it's not the thing itself. This matters for interpretation because certain poetic choices make more sense in performance context. Repetition that might seem excessive on the page could have musical justification. Line breaks that feel arbitrary in a print might correspond to melodic phrases. The poems were crafted for the ear first, the eye second. Reading them silently reverses that priority. Modern performances of Sappho's fragments sometimes add new music, reconstructed based on what we know about ancient Greek musical theory. These are educated guesses, attempts to approximate what might have been. They're valuable as experiments, as ways of hearing the texts differently, but they're not authentic reconstructions. The original music is gone forever, along with so much else. What remains are words on pages or screens, translations of fragments of poems that were once complete, that were once performed, that were once immediate and present rather than ancient and distant. We read them across an enormous gap of time, language, culture, and context. The miracle is that they still communicate anything at all. That despite everything lost, despite all the barriers, something of Sappho's voice still comes through. That voice is what people respond to when they read these fragments. Not the scholarly apparatus, not the historical context, not the linguistic analysis. The voice. The sense of a particular consciousness expressing itself through language with unusual directness and power. The fragments give us access to that consciousness, however partial and mediated. And that consciousness feels surprisingly contemporary. Or perhaps we've learned to value qualities in poetry that Sappho exemplified. The emphasis on personal experience, on emotional honesty, on concrete imagery, on compression and suggestion, rather than elaboration and explanation. These are modernist values, but they're also Sapphic values. The connection isn't accidental. Modern poets studied Sappho, learned from her, incorporated her techniques into their own practice. This influence runs deep in 20th century poetry especially. H.D.'s fragments deliberately evoke Sapphic aesthetics. Ezra Pound's imagism owes debts to her precision with images. Even poets who never explicitly reference Sappho often work in traditions she helped establish. The lyric poem as we know it, focused on personal emotion, expressed through vivid imagery in economical language, that's partly Sappho's legacy. But influence is complicated, never simple transmission. Later poets don't just imitate Sappho. They respond to her, argue with her, adapt her techniques to their own purposes and contexts. They create their own versions of what Sapphic poetry might mean, versions that sometimes diverge significantly from anything Sappho herself would recognize. This creates a pattern where Sappho exists in multiple versions simultaneously. The ancient poet who wrote complete works will never read. The medieval figure preserved in quotations and fragments. The Renaissance rediscovery that shaped European lyric tradition. The Victorian scandal that had to be explained away. The modernist inspiration for experimental verse. The contemporary icon whose sexuality matters more than it did in her lifetime. Each era constructs its own Sappho from the available materials, emphasizing different aspects, interpreting the fragments through contemporary concerns. The 2014 discovery of the brothers' poem demonstrates this perfectly. Scholars had known from ancient sources that Sappho had brothers named Charaxos and Larakos, that she'd written about Charaxos' affair with an Egyptian courtesan, that family relationships appeared in her work. But no actual poem mentioning these brothers had survived. When the papyrus appeared, excitement ran high. Finally, biographical information directly from Sappho herself, rather than from later commentators. Then people actually read it. The disappointment was palpable. This wasn't the passionate love poetry Sappho was famous for. This was domestic advice, family concerns, hopes for a brother's success. The speaker sounds anxious, practical, caught up in everyday worries about whether Charaxos will return with his ship full, whether Larakos will become a proper man. It's valuable as biographical evidence, as a window into Sappho's actual life, beyond the romantic fragments. But it's not particularly good poetry by Sapphic standards, which tells us something crucial. We have Sappho's greatest hits, the fragments that survived because people kept copying them, quoting them, preserving them across centuries. The brothers' poem survived by accident, Buried in Egyptian garbage, the quality difference matters. The fragments we treasure represent Sappho at her best, because that's what people chose to save. The mediocre stuff got discarded, forgotten, used for mummy wrapping. This selection bias shapes our entire understanding. We're not reading a representative sample of Sappho's work. We're reading what ancient and medieval readers considered worth preserving, plus whatever happened to survive by chance. The resulting picture is skewed toward love poetry, toward passionate fragments, toward the poems that shocked and amazed readers, enough that they kept copying them despite their controversial content. Her actual poetic range was probably wider. The ancient sources mention wedding songs, hymns to gods, poems about family and community. Most of that's gone. What remains creates an image of Sappho as primarily a love poet, which may or may not reflect how she saw herself or how her contemporaries understood her work. The death legend compounds the distortion. The story that she jumped from the Leucadian cliffs over unrequited love for a ferryman named Phaon appears in sources centuries after her death. It's almost certainly fiction, possibly derived from misreading her poems. Ancient comedy writers loved creating scandalous biographies for famous figures. Sappho got the tragic romantic death to match her passionate love poetry. Modern scholars reject the Phaon story as legend, but it persists in popular imagination because it's narratively satisfying. The great love poet dies for love. Never mind that she probably lived into old age, that the fragment suggests someone thinking about aging and mortality rather than leaping dramatically from cliffs. The legend is better theatre than reality. What we do know about her actual life comes mostly from the brothers' poem and scattered references in later sources. She was from Lesbos, from a wealthy family involved in local politics. She went into exile, probably during political upheavals, around 600 BC, spent time in Sicily, eventually returned home. She may have had a daughter named Cleas, though even that's uncertain since the relevant fragment could be read differently. The husband's name recorded in ancient sources, Kirkilas of Andros, is almost certainly a joke. Kirkilas is apparently a diminutive of a word meaning penis, and Andros can mean both the island and of man. The ancient equivalent of Dick Olcock or something similarly crude. Comic poets invented absurd names for historical figures. Sappho got assigned a husband whose name is basically an obscene pun, which suggests that even in antiquity, people were inventing details about her life to fit their assumptions about what a female poet's biography should include. She had to have a husband. If the real name wasn't known, invent one. The invention reveals the anxiety. How do you explain a woman achieving literary greatness in a culture that restricted women's public roles? The Thiassos theory attempted one explanation. Sappho ran a kind of finishing school for aristocratic girls, teaching them music and poetry and proper behaviour. This makes her socially acceptable, gives her a conventional female role as educator of young women. The problem is there's no evidence for it in her actual poems. Later, scholars proposed it to make Sappho respectable, to explain away the homoerotic content as pedagogical rather than romantic. Recent scholarship has moved away from the schoolteacher model, acknowledging that it was invented to sanitize Sappho's sexuality. The poems describe desire, longing, jealousy, passion. Reading them as educational exercises requires ignoring their emotional content. Better to accept that we don't fully understand the social context that made Sappho's poetry possible, and that our categories don't map neatly onto ancient realities. The sexuality question remains contentious precisely because it matters so much to contemporary readers. Sappho as lesbian icon serves important cultural functions, provides historical validation for identities often denied legitimacy. Claiming her as definitively homosexual becomes politically significant, but imposing modern identity categories on ancient texts creates its own distortions. Ancient Greek culture didn't have our concepts of sexual orientation as identity categories. They had different ways of organizing and understanding desire. Trying to definitively answer whether Sappho was lesbian in the modern sense may be asking the wrong question. What's clear is that her poems express desire for women, that this desire is central to much of her surviving work, and that ancient readers recognized this even as they sometimes condemned it. The fragmentary nature of the texts allows multiple interpretations to coexist. You can read the poems as expressing romantic love, pedagogical affection, religious devotion, or complicated mixtures of all three. The gaps permit different readings. This flexibility is part of why Sappho remains culturally productive, why each generation finds something new in the fragments. Her influence on later poetry operates through both direct transmission and creative misreading. Catullus in the 1st century BC translated Fragment 31, the poem describing physical symptoms of desire. He changed the gender of the beloved from female to male, adapting Sappho's words to describe heterosexual passion. This established a pattern where later poets borrowed her techniques while often changing the gender dynamics. The Sapphic stanza, the metrical form she supposedly invented, became a standard poetic form in Latin and later in European vernacular poetry. Horace used it extensively. It appears throughout medieval and Renaissance verse. English poets from the 16th century onward experimented with adapting it to English prosody. The form outlived the content, circulating independently of the actual poems. Medieval and Renaissance readers knew Sappho primarily through reputation and through fragments preserved in quotations. They knew she was the greatest female poet of antiquity, that Plato called her the 10th muse, that her work dealt with love and passion. They had perhaps a few complete poems and many isolated lines quoted in grammatical treatises and rhetorical handbooks. From this limited material, they constructed their own versions of what Sapphic poetry meant. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought the papyrus discoveries that dramatically expanded the corpus. Suddenly there were dozens of new fragments, some substantial enough to give real sense of complete poems. Scholars went slightly mad with excitement and exhaustion trying to piece together and edit these scraps. One lost his eyesight from the strain of working with damaged papyri. Another supposedly lost his sanity temporarily. These discoveries fundamentally changed how people read Sappho. Instead of a legendary figure known mainly through reputation, she became a poet whose actual words could be studied, analysed, translated. The fragments were still fragmentary, still damaged and incomplete, but there was enough material to support serious literary study. The translations that emerged reflected their translators' assumptions and agendas. Victorian versions often sanitized the content or emphasized the aesthetic qualities while downplaying the erotic. Early 20th century modernist translators emphasized the fragmentary nature, presented the poems as broken artifacts that embodied modernist fragmentation. Later feminist translators focused on recovering women's voices and experiences from patriarchal history. Each translation is also an interpretation, a set of choices about how to render ancient Greek into modern English, what to emphasize, what to explain, how to handle ambiguities. No translation is neutral or definitive. They're all arguments about what Sappho means, what matters in her work, how we should read these texts. The question of authenticity haunts all of this. How do we know a particular fragment is actually by Sappho? Ancient sources sometimes attributed poems to her that were probably by other poets. Medieval copyists made errors. Modern editors sometimes combine fragments from different sources into composite texts that may not represent anything Sappho actually wrote as a complete unit. The scholarly apparatus tries to sort this out, assigning different levels of confidence to different fragments. Some are certainly authentic, preserved in reliable ancient quotations. Others are probably Sappho, but can't be confirmed absolutely. Still others are possibly hers or might be by contemporaries, writing in similar styles. The uncertainty is frustrating, but unavoidable, given the evidence. What remains after all these qualifications and uncertainties is a body of poetry that continues to move readers despite its fragmentary state. The Ode to Aphrodite still works as a prayer to the goddess of love. Fragment 31 still captures the physical experience of desire with startling precision. The apple fragment still evokes longing through its simple image. These effects don't depend on having complete texts or certain attributions. They work through what's actually there on the page. Sappho's legacy isn't finally about the biographical details we'll never fully recover, or the complete poems we'll never read. It's about the fragments that survived, the words that still speak across 26 centuries, the sense of a particular consciousness expressing itself through language with unusual intensity and skill. That consciousness feels surprisingly present despite the enormous gaps in transmission, despite everything lost, despite all the mediation. Modern readers encounter Sappho through multiple filters: translation, scholarly editing, cultural assumptions, contemporary concerns. We can't read her innocently or directly. We can't know for certain what she intended or how her original audiences understood her work, but we can still read what survives and find it remarkable. The fragments create their own kind of poetry, beautiful precisely because they're incomplete, suggestive because they leave so much unsaid. That's the strange gift of the fragmentary text. It invites participation, requires imagination, makes room for readers to complete what's missing. Sappho's poems, as we have them, are collaborations between her ancient words and our contemporary reading. The gaps become productive spaces where meaning generates itself through interaction between text and reader. This isn't what Sappho intended. She wrote complete poems for specific performance contexts. But intention doesn't control reception. The fragments have their own life now, independent of original purpose. They've become something new through the process of transmission and loss. What we read when we read Sappho is both her work and the work of history itself, poetry shaped by time and chance and survival. The voice we hear is real, the product of a particular person writing in particular circumstances, but it's also constructed, assembled from fragments, translated across languages, interpreted through contemporary frameworks. Both things are true simultaneously. That's the paradox of reading ancient poetry, the double vision required to see both the original and the mediated version, to recognize the distance while still connecting with what speaks across it. The final discovery won't change what matters most. Whether we find 10 more fragments or none, Sappho remains what the surviving evidence shows: someone who turned desire into language with unprecedented precision, who made personal experience worthy of art, who wrote poems powerful enough that people kept copying them for 700 years despite cultural hostility, linguistic barriers, and changing tastes. 26 centuries separate us from her world. The gap is enormous. We can't hear her poems sung with lyre accompaniment. We can't experience them in their original performance context. We don't fully understand the social structures that made her work possible. We're missing 93% of what she wrote, but 650 lines survived against impossible odds, through fires and floods and deliberate destruction, through the transition from papyrus to parchment to print to digital, through languages that died and religions that condemned her and empires that rose and fell. The words survived because they mattered to someone in each generation who encountered them, someone who chose to copy them rather than let them disappear. That choice happened hundreds of times across thousands of years. Every time someone copied a fragment, translated a poem, quoted a line in a scholarly text, they were voting for Sappho's continued existence. The survival wasn't automatic or inevitable. It required repeated acts of preservation by people who recognized value in these ancient words. What they preserved reveals something essential about poetry's function. Sappho didn't write philosophical treatises or historical chronicles. She wrote about desire, beauty, longing, loss, personal experiences that mattered to her and apparently to readers across the centuries. The intimate made universal through precise language and vivid imagery. Fragment 31 still describes jealousy better than most contemporary poetry. The physical symptoms, the cascade of sensations, the sense of dissolution when watching someone you want talk to someone else. That hasn't changed. Bodies still respond that way. The 26th century gap collapses when you recognize your own experience in her words. The fragments work because they're grounded in specifics rather than abstractions. The apple on the highest branch, the moon setting while someone lies alone. The symptoms of desire catalogued with clinical precision. These images transcend their original context because they're rooted in physical reality that remains constant across time. Modern poetry owes her debts often unacknowledged. The emphasis on concrete imagery, on showing rather than telling, on compression and economy of language, on personal experience as legitimate subject matter. These became foundational principles partly through Sappho's example, not through direct influence always, but through a tradition she helped establish that shaped how lyric poetry developed. The fragmentary nature adds something unexpected. The gaps force active reading, demand imagination, require participation. Complete poems can be admired passively. Fragments insist on collaboration between ancient text and contemporary reader. You have to fill the silences, imagine what's missing, create meaning from pieces. This makes each encounter with Sappho slightly different. What you bring to the fragments determines what you find there. Different readers, different translators, different scholars all create their own versions based on how they complete the gaps. All these versions coexist, none definitive, all provisional. That multiplicity is appropriate for a poet whose complete works are lost. We can't recover the original, so what remains is interpretation, response, ongoing conversation about what these pieces might mean. The conversation has continued for 26 centuries. It won't end. New fragments may appear, technology improves, collections get digitized, private holdings surface. The archive isn't closed, but even without new discoveries, the existing fragments generate endless readings, translations, adaptations. They're inexhaustible because they're incomplete, productive precisely because they resist closure. Sappho's actual biography remains mostly unknown. We have scraps of information, probable details, legends that are certainly false. The woman herself is lost behind her work. What survives is the voice, the consciousness expressing itself through language with unusual directness and power. That voice speaks across the enormous gap of time, culture, language, and context. It speaks through damaged papyrus, an uncertain attribution, and multiple translations. It speaks in fragments that break off mid-thought, mid-image, mid-emotion, but it speaks. The miracle isn't that we have complete understanding. The miracle is that we have anything at all. That words written on an island in the Aegean Sea around 600 BC survived to reach readers in the 21st century. That despite everything working against preservation, despite deliberate destruction and accidental loss and simple neglect, these fragments endured. They endured because they're extraordinary, because the language achieves effects that made readers want to preserve it even when they condemned its content, because the images stick in memory, because the emotions feel true across centuries. The fragments we have represent maybe 7% of what Sappho wrote. 7%. The rest is gone, destroyed, lost, vanished into Mediterranean dust. But that 7% changed poetry. It demonstrated what personal lyric could achieve. It showed that individual experience could become universal through precise language and vivid imagery. It proved that a woman's voice could command the same respect as Homer's. Ancient readers called her the 10th Muse. They minted coins with her image. They quoted her work for 700 years. Then most of it disappeared. What remained were scraps, pieces, fragments, pulled from garbage dumps and mummy wrappings. Enough to show what was lost, enough to demonstrate that something extraordinary had existed. The scraps are all we have. They're also enough. Because poetry doesn't require completeness to work. It requires language that creates effects, images that generate meaning, voices that feel authentic. Sappho's fragments do all of that despite their damaged state. The apple on the highest branch, the moon setting while someone lies alone. The physical symptoms of desire catalogued with startling precision. These images work because they're grounded in experience that remains recognizable. Bodies haven't changed. Desire functions the same way. Loneliness feels identical across millennia. What Sappho did was find language adequate to these experiences. Language that didn't explain or abstract but showed, captured, embodied. That achievement survives fragmentation. It survives translation. It survives 26 centuries of transmission and loss. The voice we hear reading these fragments is both ancient and immediate. Ancient because it comes from a world utterly different from ours, a culture with different assumptions about gender, sexuality, religion, politics, everything. Immediate because it speaks about experiences that remain constant, emotions that transcend historical specificity. That double quality defines the fragment's power. They're simultaneously distant and present, foreign and familiar, lost and recovered. Reading them requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, seeing the historical context while also recognizing contemporary resonance, acknowledging what's missing while appreciating what remains. The fragments teach us something about how art survives, not through perfect preservation, but through repeated acts of transmission by people who recognized value. Not because institutions mandated it, but because individuals chose to copy rather than discard. The survival was never guaranteed. It required thousands of small decisions across centuries. Those decisions created what we have now, 650 lines of extraordinary poetry, fragments that reveal an intelligence at work, a consciousness expressing itself through language with unusual skill, a voice that speaks across time despite everything working against its transmission. Sappho wrote 10,000 lines. We have less than 7%. The loss is catastrophic. What remains is miraculous. Both things are true. The catastrophe makes the miracle more remarkable. That anything survived at all. That these particular fragments made it through when so much else was lost. That we can still read words written 26 centuries ago and find them moving, surprising, relevant. The fragments won't give us everything we want. They won't answer all our questions about Sappho's life, her beliefs, her relationships, her world. They'll remain partial, damaged, uncertain, but they'll continue speaking to anyone willing to listen, to fill the gaps, to participate in creating meaning from ruins. That's the condition of reading ancient poetry. You work with fragments, you accept incompleteness, you build understanding from pieces knowing the whole is lost. And somehow, despite all the obstacles, despite everything missing, something gets through, a voice, a consciousness, a sense of someone who lived and wrote, and mattered enough that people kept copying her words across centuries. Sappho exists now primarily in fragments. The fragments exist because people chose preservation over loss. That choice continues every time someone reads her work, translates a poem, teaches the fragments to students, writes about her influence. The transmission keeps happening. The voice keeps speaking. The words keep finding new readers willing to complete what's missing. The conversation between ancient text and contemporary reader won't end, can't end. The fragments remain open, productive, inexhaustible. Each generation finds something different in them, emphasizes different aspects, creates different interpretations. All these readings coexist, adding layers of meaning to words that have accumulated significance across millennia. Sappho's legacy isn't the complete works we'll never read. It's the fragments that survived, the voice that speaks through damage and loss, the evidence that someone 26 centuries ago achieved something extraordinary with language. That achievement remains visible despite fragmentation, despite translation, despite all the barriers between her world and ours. The scraps pulled from Egyptian garbage dumps changed poetry. They demonstrated possibilities that later poets explored and developed. They provided evidence that personal experience could generate great art, that individual voices mattered, that women could write as powerfully as men. These aren't small achievements. The fragments also remind us what we've lost, not just Sappho's complete works, but countless other voices that didn't survive at all. Women who wrote and weren't preserved. Poets whose work seemed less valuable to ancient editors. Perspectives that didn't fit what later generations wanted to save. The archive is full of absences, but Sappho survived, partially, fragmentarily. Enough to show us what was there, enough to prove that extraordinary poetry existed in the ancient world, created by someone whose voice still speaks. If you're willing to listen through the static of time and damage and translation, that voice is what matters finally. Not the biographical details we'll never confirm, not the complete poems we'll never read. The voice that comes through the fragments, speaking with precision and power about desire, beauty, loss, longing, the consciousness that expressed itself through language, skillfully enough that people kept copying the words across centuries, despite cultural hostility and religious condemnation. The words survived against impossible odds, through deliberate destruction and accidental loss, through the transition from oral performance to written text to print to digital, through languages that died and empires that collapsed and religions that condemned her. The words survived because they were extraordinary. They remain extraordinary. Fragment 31 still captures jealousy with startling precision. Fragment 16 still makes its case for desire's primacy. The Ode to Aphrodite still works as prayer and poetry simultaneously. The apple fragment still evokes longing through its simple image. These effects don't depend on completeness. They work through what's actually there. Sappho wrote poetry 26 centuries ago on an island in the Aegean Sea. Most of it vanished. What remained was enough to change how poetry works, to influence writers across 2 millennia, to provide evidence that women's voices matter, to demonstrate that personal experience can become universal through precise language. The fragments are all we have. They're also everything we need.